Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. We have some breaking news. Kevin Lee has re-signed with the UFC. I'm going to give my reaction. I'm going to discuss the real reason that I believe Kevin Lee was cut back in late 2021. We're going to discuss the reason that he was re-signed to the UFC because you look at his resume, and we're going to talk about this here in a second. It's not like he went out and reeled off 10-fight win streak and then got re-signed with the UFC. So we're going to discuss the real reason that Kevin Lee was re-signed with the UFC. I believe it's something that nobody else is going to mention. And I'm also going to discuss who I think Kevin Lee will fight in his UFC return. So first off, Kevin Lee was cut back in late 2021 after dropping 2 fights straight. His last UFC fight was against Daniel Rodriguez, August 28th, 2021. He lost his fight via unanimous decision. The fight before that, he fought Charles Oliveira. He was stopped via guillotine choke. This was back in March of 2020. Now, it sounds crazy, and a lot of people were flipping out when Kevin Lee was cut. People were saying, how could Kevin Lee be cut? And, you know, a 2-fight losing streak, I think it is a little bit crazy for them to cut a guy as young as Kevin Lee who had shown as much promise in the past as Kevin Lee. But you also had to look at the fact that he had lost 4 out of his last 5. You know, he had a loss to Rafael Dos Anjos. He had a loss to Ali Quinta as well. The only win was at UFC 244 where he slept Gregor Gillespie. So it wasn't totally unreasonable for them to cut Kevin Lee, but it was a little bit unexpected. You know, a lot of people did not expect the UFC to part ways with Kevin Lee, especially considering he was so young. So anyway, he goes and signs with Eagle FC, which is Khabib Nurmagomedov's promotion. And his last fight was at Eagle FC 46 against Diego Sanchez. This was in March of 2022. And, you know, Kevin Lee did not look impressive in this fight. At this point, Diego Sanchez is essentially a dead corpse. And Kevin Lee went out there, and I know he injured himself in the fight, supposedly tore his ACL, whatever. And he's had a litany of knee injuries over the course of his MMA career. But to have a competitive fight with Diego Sanchez, considering where Diego Sanchez is in today's day and age, that's not a fight that's going to get you back into the UFC. That's not a fight that should get you back into the UFC. So that's actually pretty shocking. We're going to talk about why I think Kevin Lee was re-signed. And then basically Eagle FC fell off the face of the earth. We don't know what's going on. We haven't been given any update. In my opinion, I feel like Eagle FC is going out of business. Khabib Nurmagomedov's probably burning money. There was a lot of poor mismatch. You know, they signed Bigfoot Silva at one point, and that ultimately didn't come to fruition. And I just think Eagle FC was probably burning money. Khabib Nurmagomedov doesn't even want to coach MMA anymore, let alone run a promotion, which probably, you know, requires a lot more time. So I think eventually, basically, Eagle FC, the writing is on the wall. It's probably going to close down. And basically, Kevin Lee was looking for a new home. And last month, Kevin Lee did an interview where he essentially alluded to he would rather go to the PFL than re-sign with the UFC, that $1 million prize was looking awfully, you know, he wanted that $1 million prize, and it was looking, you know, awfully enticing for him. And so it was speculated essentially that Kevin Lee was going to then go to PFL, join PFL, fight in the welterweight or lightweight division of PFL, and look to win the $1 million. And he even basically said, you know, I don't want to with the UFC. You know, I don't want to re-sign with the UFC. He was pissed off about the original UFC release. He didn't even get a call. You know, he went off that he didn't even get a call. He found out online just like the fans. And essentially, he did not want to re-sign with the UFC. But then a couple days ago, he posted some pictures with Dana White and Hunter Campbell on his Instagram and teased essentially a UFC return. And now it has been announced today, it is official that he is returning to the UFC. And I just think it's crazy because 1 month ago, I'm looking at an MMA Junkie article right now. Kevin Lee sees big opportunity with PFL, says he'd be hurting his leverage if he returned to the UFC. And in this interview, he was basically saying, I don't want to ever fight in the UFC again. You know, he was saying maybe if the right deal presents itself. Well, I guess the right deal presented itself because Kevin Lee is now back in the UFC and he's only 30 years old. And I know a lot of people were shocked when he was cut from the organization. I didn't think it was crazy shocking. But Kevin Lee's only 30 years old, so it's not that crazy that the UFC decided to re-sign him. My initial reaction, honestly, was kind of, I don't really care, to be honest. Kevin Lee's been one of those guys who's just been super inconsistent. And I know he garners a lot of attention because he does a lot of talking. But a lot of the time, 9 times out of 10, he doesn't end up living up to the hype that he does with his abilities on the mic. The only time really that he ever did was when he beat Michael Chiesa. He talked a lot of crap in the lead up of that fight, and he ended up stopping Michael Chiesa via rear naked choke. And this was a weird fight where there was a weird stoppage. But Kevin Lee, he fought for the interim belt against Tony Ferguson. He had a great performance in the first round. Eventually gets stopped in the third round, submitted by Tony Ferguson. He beats Edson Barboza, but had a lot of trouble in that fight, got rocked badly. Losses to Ali Quinta, lost to Rafael Dos Anjos. Not a terrible loss to have. Win over Gregor Gillespie. Who even knows where Gregor Gillespie is at this point? And then the loss to Charles Oliveira and Daniel Rodriguez. So Kevin Lee's always been one of those guys that's just been super inconsistent. There's been times where he looks so good, and then his next fight, he just looks terrible. And I know he's been riddled with injuries, but I just don't see him being super competitive in the lightweight division, nor do I see him super competitive in the welterweight division. So even though I kind of am happy to see, Kevin Lee fighting UFC caliber opponents again, and I'm curious, people like to throw this around all the time. People were saying about Derek Lewis going into the Spivak fight. Can this be Kevin Lee 2.0? So it does kind of interest me. But at the same time, Kevin Lee's going to say, I'm going to be a champion. He's not going to be a lightweight champion, okay? I'm telling you that right now. Look how deep the lightweight division is. And he's definitely not going to be a welterweight champion. Look how deep the welterweight division is. And Kevin Lee just doesn't have the size to compete with guys like Kamaru Usman or Khamzat Chimaev or even Gilbert Burns. Gilbert Burns is much bigger than him. I think Gilbert Burns would sub him badly. And I think he would do it in a rather dominant fashion. So I'm not all that excited, but I do think it'll be interesting to see how the UFC ends up matchmaking Kevin Lee in his next fight. So we're going to talk about what kind of opponent I think the UFC is going to match him up with in his return. But let's talk about his departure from the UFC, because I really thought something was super interesting, because Kevin Lee was a semi-popular fighter. I'm not saying he's a star, and he was only on a 2-fight losing streak. And the UFC cut him. And there was a comment that I saw that Kevin Lee made at some point. And I almost wonder, was Kevin Lee cut because his agent was CAA? It was an agency that also repped Francis Ngannou at the time. The UFC was having massive negotiations with that same agency. And it would not be beyond the UFC and Dana White and Hunter Campbell to look to hurt them. They had every right to cut Kevin Lee. He's coming off a loss. He's in a 2-fight losing streak. And the UFC likes to try to control these managers, likes to try to control these agencies. And it would not shock me. And now, at the time, it didn't look like this to me. But now, looking at the fact that they re-signed him, and we're going to get to another part of that in a second, it's looking to me that they cut him as retribution to that agency because of sour negotiations during the Francis Ngannou negotiations. I honestly believe that, because Kevin Lee did nothing since then. He's done nothing. If anything, Kevin Lee's brand is more hurt after his one fight, his one win outside of the UFC, than it was if he just sat around for the last 2 years. To have a close fight or a competitive fight with a washed up Diego Sanchez, that doesn't elevate his stock at all. I think that puts his stock in the toilet. He looked horrible in that fight, and Diego Sanchez looked horrible. And Diego Sanchez looked like he shouldn't even been in there. And Kevin Lee had a competitive fight with him. So now I'm starting to think, I think the UFC cut him as retribution. And the other factor that you have to take into account, Kevin Lee left that agency. And guess who he signed with? Dominance MMA, a.k.a. Ali Abdelaziz. Who Ali Abdelaziz, the reason he's such a big manager is because he doesn't necessarily always work in the favor of his fighters. He does to an extent, but he also does for the UFC as well. And that's why Ali and the UFC has such a good relationship. Apparently, Ali's really good friends with Hunter Campbell or Mick Maynard. I can't remember which one it is. And I think because Kevin Lee signed with Ali Abdelaziz, I think Ali Abdelaziz, because of his relationship with the UFC, was able to get Kevin Lee another opportunity within the UFC. I believe that is the real reason that he was cut, and I believe that is the real reason that he was re-signed. Because He didn't do anything. Does this Diego Sanchez win really get him? If the UFC didn't believe he was, UFC caliber when they cut him after he lost to Daniel Rodriguez, do they really believe a win over Diego Sanchez, one win in the last basically 2 years at this point against Diego Sanchez is enough to get re-signed? I don't think so. So I think Kevin Lee signing with Dominance MMA is what got him another opportunity with the UFC. And I guess Kevin Lee, hopefully he got a decent deal because he's saying, I want that $1 million. Is the UFC going to pay him $1 million? Probably not. Well, now who is Kevin Lee going to fight in his return? And I think Kevin Lee may grow to regret this decision to re-sign with the UFC because I really don't think Kevin Lee is going to be looking at, becoming a title contender in the next year or two. He's still young. Don't get me wrong. I could be dead wrong. He's looked promising at points in the past. I don't know what division he's going to fight in, but I think the UFC is going to use Kevin Lee as a stepping stone. UFC fans at least know Kevin Lee's name, at least to a substantial period. People do recognize the Kevin Lee name. He's not a massive star, but a decent amount. All the hardcores know who Kevin Lee is. And I think the UFC is going to look to use him as a stepping stone. So who does that match him up with? Kevin Lee's calling out Khamzat Chimaev. Could that fight happen? Yes, it could. Because the UFC, we saw with the Nate Diaz fight, they booked Nate Diaz, Khamzat Chimaev. The UFC is looking to give Khamzat fights where he's not likely to lose, but will also give him a boost in name recognition. And this checks all the boxes. Khamzat would wreck Kevin Lee badly. Kevin Lee's calling for the Khamzat fight. It's a very winnable fight for Khamzat, and it would elevate Khamzat's name, and it wouldn't be super risky for the UFC. If the UFC books like Khamzat Chimaev versus Robert Whittaker, it would be super risky. So I don't think, they're going to book that type of fight. So they may very well do Khamzat Chimaev versus Kevin Lee. But if they don't, I think they're going to try to build another contender off of Kevin Lee's name. And a couple names I came up with was Renat Fakhretdinov. If Kevin Lee does return to the welterweight division, I really see the UFC booking him up with someone like that who they want to build into a future contender. Fakhretdinov looked super impressive in his last fight against Brian Battle. Absolutely destroyed him. Another name who recently fought at UFC Brazil, Gabriel Bonfim. I really think that's another name that, could end up fighting Kevin Lee. The UFC has seen the Bonfim brothers. They look super impressive. John Anik's already got corny lines written about them. And I think they could book that fight to try to build Bonfim's name off of Kevin Lee. Now, another potential opponent. If Kevin Lee does decide to return to lightweight, Arman Tsarukyan needs an opponent. And while this wouldn't be a step up in competition, at least it would be a decent name for Arman, and there's really not a whole lot of options depending on how that top end of the lightweight division plays out. I could see the UFC doing Kevin Lee versus Arman Tsarukyan. And for Kevin Lee, even though these are all tough matchups, they put him back into that contender discussion. So I do think Kevin Lee would take all these fights. One last name I'll throw at you, Paddy Pimblett. If Kevin Lee does fight at lightweight, I could see the UFC looking at that performance versus Diego Sanchez. I hate to harp on it for like the 16th time in this video. And they're thinking, Paddy Pimblett could probably beat Kevin Lee. If the Kevin Lee that showed up against Diego Sanchez in March of 2022 shows up against Paddy Pimblett, I'm picking Paddy Pimblett. So that is another name. So it's going to be one of these up-and-coming guys who's super talented, who they're going to look to build Kevin Lee's name or build the name of that fighter off of Kevin Lee's name. And if Kevin Lee happens to win, then, it's going to be one of those things where Kevin Lee has now, propelled himself into the top of the division or a contender within the division at bare minimum, top 10 if he beats a lot of these names, especially if it's Khamzat Chimaev or, it's not really going to be Paddy Pimblett, but Khamzat Chimaev or Arman Tsarukyan. He's going to put himself in a good position. Obviously, if he fights Bonfim or Fakhretdinov, it's not going to be the same situation. Maybe he gets to the top 15 off of one of those wins. But I really do believe the UFC is looking at Kevin Lee. They're looking at his name value, and they're going to try to put him in there against an opponent that can get a win over Kevin Lee and use Kevin Lee as a stepping stone in their career. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Who do you think Kevin Lee's going to fight? Are you excited that Kevin Lee's returning to the UFC? Because honestly, I'm not super excited for this. So let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.